Hello, everyone. Welcome to the online forest summit called BC Forest, the People's Convergence. Today, we're having a kind of a casual conversation with Herb Hammond, Taryn Skalbania, and we're going to cover some various topics, mostly focusing on tenure and moving in that direction. Herb, we just had an interesting chat, and you were talking about some loggers that you've worked with. Tell us what you were sharing with Taryn and I.
Well, over the years of learning about forests and nature-based planning and applying it in various parts of BC and across Canada, I've had the chance to work with a lot of loggers, and it's interesting to me that many of the loggers I've worked with made the shift from clear-cut industrial forestry to nature-based forestry. Where full cycle trees are left and forests are always left after a day's work. And one of the things I can reflect upon is that over almost 40 years of working with people like that, I cannot think of a single case where someone made the shift from clear-cut industrial forestry to nature-based forestry and went back. They all have told me how much better they feel about doing it, that it suits their intuition and their hearts. It's what they always felt, and they oftentimes describe the tension and stress they felt carrying out industrial forestry. So I think there are real human benefits there, and I think there is a willing support group out there amongst forest workers and loggers that will carry forth the idea of nature-based planning.
So citizens have to unite and create the political will for things to move in this direction. Taryn, you had something, shout out to Indigenous.
Yeah. Sure, speaking of political will, we have two First Nations natural resources or logging outfits here in the Okanagan, West Bank First Nations and Titiks Resources and Penticton Indian Band. And they are both doing alternative or different options to FERPA forestry. They are abandoning some of the Forest Range Practices Act minimum requirements, and they are doing more traditional ecological knowledge forestry. And one issue they have is clear cuts. They can't wrap their heads around it. That was never done traditionally by First Nations. They never cut down more than they needed. They never cut down more than they could use. They didn't cut down 100% of things to burn 25% of it in a pile. So I think if First Nations tell the government to take FERPA and give it a boot, then the rest of the communities can follow suit.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so I keep muting myself here today because not only is it super smoky where I am in Grand Forks, but also the sawmill is going hard at her today, and I live right across the river from the sawmill, so I don't know if you guys can hear it, but the logging continues at an incredibly fast rate while the forests burn. Anyways, next topic is tenures. To Herb or Taryn, who wants to start this one off?
That's Herb.
Well, this is kind of a follow-up to the presentation and discussion we had on tenure a while ago. And I want to pick up on a theme that I've heard people talking about, and that's that the way to deal with tenure is through incremental change of tenure. Tenure is something that I became aware of 40 years ago as being a big stumbling block. And along with a handful of others and sometimes a growing number of people, we have tried for those decades to incrementally change tenure, and it hasn't worked. So I don't quite understand where the magic bullet of incremental change will suddenly emerge from, given that a number of us have tried lots of different ways to do that. And I think that's there's a very real reason behind that, and that's that the timber industry's major focus is on ensuring that they keep tenure, that the laws protect tenure, the policies protect tenure, the standards, if there are any for forestry, protect tenure. And the reality for me is that getting rid of tenure is really a simple decision, because first of all, no special interest group should control public forests. They should be controlled by a publicly accountable agency, and that agency should be transparent. It should be the requirements for how the public interest is protected in forests need to be legislated, so that if that's not followed by people using forests, that there's the opportunity to hold people accountable through litigation. We don't have that right now at all. And we're not going to get that by having nice discussions with the fox while the rest of the foxes are busily eating the chickens, you know. And I wish that we could have that kind of change, but I don't see it happening.
Well, it's like that expression that the system is broken. This system isn't broken. This system was created for a particular purpose. It's being propped up for a particular purpose, and it works really well. Yep. So trying to change little bits and pieces of this system isn't going to work, because it has a purpose and it's working really well. So we can't fiddle around the edges. We got to change the whole thing and dump it and restart.
Yes. And that leads me to a good example of that, Jennifer, is the fact that the industry would be happy to say that, okay, citizens movement, we'll sit down with you and negotiate changes to tenure. Well, that doesn't work because that's not a balanced table. You don't have balanced legal and political rights sitting there. In fact, you have the timber industry with very skewed and very strong political and legal rights, and communities with few legal rights and a little bit more than they used to have political power, but not nearly the political power that the industry does. I mean, community leaders don't have lunch with the minister, but timber industry lobbyists do. And so if you were going to negotiate, if the industry was sincere in a negotiation with communities and the public in general about taking better care of forests, there are some preconditions that would need to be met. First of all, there needs to be agreement on the part of government and industry that their decision makers will be sitting at that table, just like community decision makers, so that the people sitting at that table don't blindside the public at some point down the road to say, well, we tried to make that change, but our bosses said no. Well, that can't happen. And the other big thing is there needs to be a moratorium on planning and logging, particularly in any kind of contentious areas. Mm-hmm. But by and large, if I were writing the rules, I would say a moratorium, period. Boy, you want to get some incentive for the industry to negotiate? Okay, then there's some incentive. But that's a way that you can balance the playing field a little bit to help people in general to have a little bit more political power at that table. The other thing is, the primary discussion should not be how to log. The primary discussion should be where logging is socially and ecologically inappropriate, and that those areas are removed from further consideration for logging. And then the industry and government also need to agree that in the future, the decisions that are reached at that table will be honored, that needs to be put eventually into legislation. It needs to become law. And the last thing, precondition that's important, is that all throughout that process, there has to be a commitment on all parties' sides that the information they present is supported by scientific knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and or verifiable results in the field that people can go look at. Not just a story, but that people can get in a truck and go look at and say, oh, okay, that makes sense. So if you had those kinds of, those are the kinds of preconditions that you'd have to level that particularly political playing field. And I just don't see that happening with industry. We've tried, I've tried in my own community, I tried in other communities, and you know, what those preconditions that I'm laying out are exactly what the industry doesn't want to give up. So you know, that they're not going to go there. And without those conditions, I have a real fear for communities and environmental groups, citizens movements on this, is that if you get engaged in incremental change, there will be a process. And what I've seen happen over and over again is dividing and conquering the movement there, because some people are sincere, and I respect that, to sit down and want to try to work it out with government and industry. And another faction is going to say, no, this is a waste of time. And we've seen this happen before. Without these preconditions, we're not going to get to where we want to go. And for a while, that kind of exists in limbo. But then what happens with the first group that is sitting down, I've also seen the danger of the process becoming the focus, not the issues that people came to the process to resolve, but the process itself becomes what is sustained by that group. And suddenly you get industry and government seeing these two groups. You get the ones at the table, which are the moderates, and the ones that are obviously well versed in what's going on and headed in the right direction. And then you have the radicals over here who just aren't very reasonable, not the kind of people we really want to deal with. And so you divide and conquer the movement, and that leaves communities with less, not more. And so that's another reason to, in my view, to avoid the pitfalls of incremental change with tenure.
Yeah, and Taryn and I have come across a lot of other community representatives who spent, I don't know how many hundreds of hours meeting with the local FLNRORD representative, meeting with BCTS, and so many wasted hours.
Interior health, or with lawyers, or with ombudsmen, with compliance and enforcement officers, with whoever, forestry practice boards, hours and hours. Yeah.
And there's no point in meeting with any of them because A, they're not the decision makers in many cases, and B, they're working within the system. They're constrained by the current system, and it's the system that has to change. And something else that you said, Herb, you were talking about making decisions based on, you know, where first start with where not to log and decide if it's, you said socially and ecologically inappropriate to log there. Well, I would make the case that Grand Forks, with the huge 2018 flood and the impact on the community, I would say it's socially, economically, and ecologically inappropriate to continue logging in this watershed. I've only added up some of the numbers. I don't even know all the numbers of the impact of the flood, and it's $103 million. And there's way more extensive costs than that in just this very small community. And I think Taryn would probably also agree that it's socially inappropriate to continue logging in the Peachland watershed.
Well, I think your point about the economics is a really good one, because what you're looking at there is real economics, the economics of the community, the economics of the public interest. But what Interfor looks at is a corporate financial appraisal. And all those other costs of flooding, of loss of infrastructure, that's what economists call externalizing them to us. And in effect, government, by their permissiveness in letting forestry continue to happen the way it is, are also part and parcel of that externalizing the costs to the public that they allegedly are there to protect, which is a bit ironic in my view. And it's you know, there's an old saying that has a huge amount of truth in it, and that's good ecology is good economics. And you have, both of you have just laid that out. I mean, when I look at the Peachland watershed and I look at the externalized costs to Peachland, or the externalized costs to Grand Forks because of how forestry is being done, that's ridiculous. And it's ridiculous for the government to suggest that we have some world-leading form of forestry and not to worry, we're the most sustainable on the planet, blah, 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 blah. That violates one of those preconditions that I mentioned of supporting what you say with good information. And those kinds of statements don't do that.
And speaking of sending out the government or industry, but in this case, the government sending out a few representatives to talk to the people, and they're not people who have decision-making power. The old growth panel reports, Taryn, you had a peek at that today. It just came out. And so yeah, okay, they sent out 2 representatives who went across the province or talked on Zoom to a lot of people across the province. And then they went back, and supposedly we were told they were supposed to be making recommendations to cabinet. And, you know, we were all out here holding our breath. Oh, maybe good things will happen for old growth. So what's your takeaway? Yeah, I know you haven't gone in depth into that report yet, but first takeaways, Taryn?
Well, my first takeaway is exactly what Herb just mentioned. It's a divide and conquer. They, by incremental changes to old growth, they have split I think the environmental movement. Some environmental groups are saying, great, thanks for this little tidbits. Some are saying, oh, it's okay. And some are saying, you know, this is garbage. This is nothing. This is just kicking the can down the road till the next election. This is not law. You've just deferred things for 3 years before cutting them. So it's really, it's nothing meaningful in my eyes. And it's 9 little areas. The size of the entire Metro Vancouver area total is being saved across the entire province of BC. 9 little areas altogether, and 1,000 trees of significant size.
1,000?
1,000. It's but add that to the 54 they already saved. It's an embarrassment for our government. And they did go to 200 different communities, and they had 9,000 people fill in surveys, and it was overwhelming, the percentage of people save all old growth, moratorium all old growth, 60, 70, 80%. They ignored those facts. For what? For jobs. You know what? In Peachland, the last census, there are 6 jobs in forestry, 6 out of the 5,500. We're saving for 6 jobs. I know it's province-wide, it's different, but if you're not a forestry dependent community, we are all forest dependent communities, healthy forests. And so that's my take on old growth report. I haven't read it all, of course. There might be some nuggets in there.
Oops.
Where do we go from here? Good Lord.
I don't know if you can hear me or not.
No, you disappeared on me.
Seems to be acting up here suddenly.
You're frozen, Herb. Oh, there
okay.
we go. You're back.
I just wanted to stick in a couple of other things here about tenure. And first of all, let's keep in mind that the decision to issue tenure in the 40s and 50s was a decision of the government of the day in their minds to create rural communities, provide for jobs in rural communities. I don't think it was a very wise way, the way they did it, but it was still a political decision that was made to allegedly address a social and economic need in rural BC. So just as that was a political decision to issue tenure, we now have a really excellent social and political need to get rid of tenure, and that's the climate emergency. And we can also add to that the failure to produce jobs, the degradation of forest ecosystems, the fact that forestry is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases in BC, sometimes by orders of magnitude. And so it can be done, the contracts can be canceled, and they can be canceled for social reasons. And that's been done elsewhere. It's been done in Canada. It's been done around the world in those situations where social and, in this case, ecological imperatives are there to catalyze those things. And the last thing I want to say about tenure is we're out of time to talk about this. You know, the climate emergency, if for no other reason, and the biodiversity crisis tell us we have to make that change. I mean, it's an obvious thing that there's a big consensus amongst many people that it has to happen. Now we need to develop a consensus of how to do it quickly, not just go down paths we've gone down before that don't get us to the ending that we need.
Well, the tenure system has proven itself to be an economic and social failure. You know, the amount of for GDP that forestry takes up, the number of jobs in BC that forestry provides, they're steadily going down. So tenure, maybe at one time it was an experiment that they had in mind, that this was going to provide jobs and it was going to support local communities
and keep forests, keep trees. It was supposed to supply a constant supply of trees as well, and they haven't done that. No jobs, no trees, no mills, no communities.
Yeah, so it's an experiment that's had many decades to prove itself, and it's proven that it fails on all of those levels. So it's time for something new, and no more tinkering around with it.
You know, one really interesting possibility for how this could happen quickly is that Indigenous nations in BC have a strong measure of political and legal clout at this moment. Long overdue, that's for sure. But I wonder if Indigenous nations were presented with the option for nature-based and culturally based plans for their territories, with the additional piece there that be managed through government to government relations. So their government agencies, colonial government agencies, being accountable to their respective publics to protect the public interest as enshrined in nature-based plans. That may very well be a step that gets not only to real reconciliation, but gets to applying a system that is respectful and reciprocal and gratitude-filled for forests and nature. And because I think in my work with Indigenous people, that way of relating, that way of being, is one that is shared and comes from in Indigenous nations. So that may very well be, but I think you can't just hand First Nations over to tenure holders. because what they'll do is ensure that First Nations get a tenure with all of the specifications that they have. They want to co-manage that with Indigenous people. So working that out is going to require communities and citizens sitting down with Indigenous leaders and talking that through. But that could happen fairly quickly. And if there is a consensus built around that, then maybe the whole concept of tenure could disappear in favor of government agencies that look after forests, those government agencies being a combination of Indigenous nations and the colonial nation we refer to as British Columbia.
Taryn, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Herb. Why would First Nations want to continue doing forestry the way that they've been protesting the colonial Western way of forestry for the last 50, 60 years? Why would they want to continue? I mean, they can see it's obviously not working.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Herb and Taryn, for this sort of less formal kind of thing, just a conversation that's going to be a bit of a bonus for the summit. I think, Herb, you presented some really compelling solutions potential there, and those are things that we need to continue to talk about. All right, thanks so much, you guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you, Herb. Bye-bye.
Yes. Good night.
Night.